we had in the past a debate also with Michel Bauwens,
Yeah,
where Michel Bauwens has this vision of like when you get into the dark ages, this is
yeah,
when the commons emerge as the safety net in order
yeah,
to actually like save society. And so the commons have this tendency of prospering when you have like the darkest ages. But when you don't have those dark ages, then no one cares about the commons because you just have the state or the market that is managing well enough. And I feel like you're kind of, if I understand correctly, you're kind of in the same line when you say that we do need some kind of negativity or like dark ages and so forth, like something, there needs to be a crisis in order for collaboration to emerge, in order for the commons to flourish and so forth. So what we're trying to think about when we're thinking about the network nation is like some form of collaboration that is not a collaboration between existing nation states or existing institution, but it's a collaboration that is kind of like translocal, trans institution where you just have a bunch of humans across the globe that feel that they belong to their own nation that is not the nation state type of nation, but is like nation that has emerged from digital proximity as opposed to physical proximity.
yeah.
And those nations are intrinsically translocal, international, and so forth. And the collaboration between nations somehow emerge as an emergent property of the fact that you have people in multiple nation states that belong to the same network nation and therefore engage into this more common-based approach for the desire of managing their own affairs. But because they are translocal in their nature, then they also can tackle challenges that usually will require collaboration between different nation states. And so
Right.
the question I'm raising here is like, while perhaps, I'm not sure I agree, but while I'm very happy to accept the idea that nation state will not collaborate unless there is something very critical.
Yeah.
But do you think the same is true for individuals? And do you think that if we find ways, if we find an institutional scaffolding that facilitates the collaboration of individuals on a trans-local level, does that need negativity, or actually is it just because they want to collaborate, because they feel that they are part of this network nation, collaboration slash common based approaches can flourish independently of the crisis?
Okay. Yeah, that's very clarifying, and that helps me a lot. So, I guess the dark ages that Michelle's referring to would be I would relate to that dark ages as in a situation where uh the negativities that I was referring to, whether they're global warming or global capital and their associated interdependent complex effects, if there was no higher order emergent forcing function to deal with these issues, then it would lead me to the belief that we're head deeper into the dark ages. And I know that Michelle refers to the dark ages, for example, of the collapse of the Roman Empire as an example, and also the rise of Christianity as kind of helping build a commons in the 5th century. Um, Yeah, so in a world where, well, one, I'll say, like, I think that we are, as individuals, in a negativity, like concretely, or a crisis. I think that negativity is in the social breakdown, like the social breakdown of states and markets, to deal with human concerns. I mean, in a way, markets are doing well, but they're not doing well on the level of human valuation. Um, and of course, states are not doing well on the level of human valuation. So I think we're in an objective social breakdown. And in that objective social breakdown, we have to rebuild social networks. I think that what I'm doing right now with Philosophy Portal and what many other organizations I see around me are doing is kind of like seeds of a network nation. How I understand what you're saying, it's translocal. And there's sort of an affiliation, which is based on, yeah, affiliation through digital networks. So I think it is already existing. So I would say that, yeah, like we have to rebuild social networks in an innovative way, in a way that can't be defined as either state or market, but perhaps has alliances with different actors on the state and the market. How I understand the commons is that it requires a different kind of subjectivity. And that different kind of subjectivity, as far as I understand it, and through conversations with Michel, is on the basis of a contributive economy. So we just have to not be motivated either by our national identity or our market-driven logic. So just, profit-driven logic. So, but that contributive-based mode of subjectivity is just something that requires learning the cracks and the gaps of being human, right? And all of the different, and in many ways, I feel like the institutions which have broken down were protecting people from being human in a way. Because when your career is safely constrained within an institutional setting, or you have a successful business, you don't really have to worry about the human too much. So in a situation again where the states and the markets aren't working, I think at the end of the day, it's about the the commons will only be based on a different mode of subjectivity, a mode of subjectivity that's more based on contribution rather than, again, profit logic or state identity logic. Um, and yeah, that's that. I mean, I think that's where we are. That's what we have to do. I am sort of theoretically skeptical about whether commons models can completely solve whatever we want to call it, the meta crisis or the global negativities that we face. But it's certainly a key part of the solution. And I mean, I'd love to be proved wrong. If the commons can emerge as a dominant model, that would be fantastic. I just think it requires a lot of subjectivity.
What do you mean by subjectivity?
I mean, just by like the basic way that you as a subject engage with the world. If it's based on most people are not engaging on a contributive logic. And I think in order to go to the basis, I'll say this just to simplify it to the utmost. I think that the best examples of the commons are probably marriages and friendships. I think marriages and friendships are naturally based on a contributive commons logic. So by definition, something like a commons-based network nation would have to be built on the seed forms of something like marriages and friendships. And I think in that order, like I think if you bypass marriages, long-term sexual relationships as the seed form of the commons could be a mistake, but certainly friendships as seed forms of commons. And there is possibility to build like robust networks from that point of view. And I would take a robust network of marriages and friendships as the healthiest basis for a civil society. And certainly in a situation where our capacity for long-term relationality is breaking down, that could be potentially quite revolutionary.
So when you talk about this subjectivity,
Yeah, yeah,
so one of the premises on which we are basing all of our thinking, and this is also maybe a point of contentious discussion, is like Balaji focus on the network states, which is basically how do we reinvent the states in the age of networks, which is basically fragmenting the state into non-contiguous areas around the world. What we're trying to focus on is network nations. So we're more interested in fragmenting the nation in non-contiguous side around the world. So one question that maybe you have an opinion on
yeah,
is like in the same way as like nations, even beyond commons, right? The nation
yeah,
is some degree of like subjectivity where people act in a particular manner with strangers, but nonetheless feel this sense of kinship with the strangers because the strangers are part of a shared identity, shared culture, shared aspiration, etc. And this is oftentimes emerging with like these imagined communities of like, you know, that people have been orbitating in the same cultural background. And so in some way, we're part of the same nation. And so we're just gonna support each other. Do you feel that with the advent of network technologies and this repeated interaction in the digital sphere as opposed to the physical space, do you think that this same sense of kinship that we see emerging in a traditional physically ground nation is emerging or has the potential to emerge in the digital sphere?
It's a really good question. I definitely do feel a sense of kinship with people who are trying to do similar things to me. And at the same time, because a lot of what we're doing in the network form is operating under techno-feudal conditions, there's a very, very, very high level of conflict and potential for intense rivalry and so zero sum competition basically. So that can, I mean, at the end of the day, it can come down to a problem of capital. I mean, a lot of the kinship that people feel, or a lot of kinship people felt from the nation, had to be reinforced with social contracts. So at the end of the day, my biggest concern with something like a network nation would be the basis of social contracts that actually provide us with the material capacity to build lifelong projects with each other. And if that material capacity isn't there, then what's much more likely is that we're entering into a phase of, I don't want to call it fascism, but I do see more national socialisms on the horizon. And those national socialisms are going to be based on ethnic blood ties. And it's much more likely that if there's not a solution to the problem of capital and material social contract, then people are going to gravitate towards those ethnic identifications more than these higher order abstract network nation identifications, which do require a higher level of abstract solidarity than, for example, the National Socialisms will. So at the end of the day, for me, the possibility of the network nation, it comes down to can we build towards an actual social contract for people involved in network nations that allows for uh, a practical thriving. Otherwise, it will dissolve into zero sum competition because we're all on techno feudal platforms.
So the network nation is an ambiguous term because we use it to refer simultaneously to the nation, to the group of individuals which find some degree of early kinship with one another because of digital proximity, and for the novel institutional scaffolding that doesn't need to look at all like a state, because the state is the scaffolding that we created for nations that are on a particular territory. So if we remove the territory, we still need an institutional scaffolding. And I think you're quite right that this institutional scaffolding is what holds on the social contract, or what implements the social contract. And so one thing that we're trying to figure out is, if we agree, and let's assume that we agree about the idea that network population of people feel some at least preliminary degree of kinship that can lead them to proto-nations, then both in terms of maintaining this kinship or reinforcing this kinship, enabling self-governance, and there is also the big question of sovereignty that came about, which is, as you say, if we are a network nation that is governing itself on a techno-feudal platform, then in the end we are at the mercy of the techno-feudal platform, which means that we have absolutely no sovereignty as a nation, as opposed to engaging with more self-sovereign infrastructures, call them Web3 or decentralized network or whatever you want. But then the other question, and that didn't come up to any conclusion because we didn't discuss much about it, but the question, the latent question is, if we have to create this institutional scaffolding, what is the social contract theory that subtend it, and what is the manifestation of this social contract theory that can be created in order to create an alternative to a state, not because it's competing or because it's trying to outweigh the state as a nation state, but because a digital nation doesn't need a state and needs something else in order to self-govern.
So this is a matrix of different sovereign models that we've been under since basically 1789. The main models are constitutional monarchies, parliamentary republics, and presidential republics. And then, of course, you have theocratic republics, absolute monarchies, one-party states, military juntas, provisional governments, and theocracies. At the moment, I think the only actual theocracy is an Islamic theocracy. But the point is that when we think about the complexities of sovereignty, the question is when we try to create something that's beyond the nation state, what's far more probable is that you create a lower form of government, right? It's far more likely that network nation becomes something like either like a monarchy or some sort of weird one-party state or some provisional government. You know what I mean? Like in order to build something of the complexity of a parliamentary republic or a presidential republic, it's you have to get so into the weeds with how politics actually works that it's far more likely to create something of a regressive institution. So my main point there is that we need to study the history of governance. And we need to study the history of governance in relationship to the major state revolutions. Now, I do agree that we are in a territory that's so strange and different that maybe we need to drop the notion of nation even. Like, I know you guys are referring to network nation and as something that's different than the nation state, but the tendency to monopolization, the tendency to dictatorship, the tendency to some one-party monopolization of power, if those problems are not taken seriously, they will dominate. Above, certainly they will dominate over just a general vague ethos of egalitarianism or cooperation or kinship. Like that's not going to hold a real nation. Like a nation needs like a parliamentary system or a presidential system, right, where power is actually systematically diffused, and democratically organized. Now, this to me brings us to what is the problem of Marxism, which is democracy. One way of thinking about it is democracy in the workplace. But how do you do that? Like the word that Marxists use is dictatorship of the proletariat. But a dictatorship of the proletariat has never worked. It's always been too unstable and it falls apart. Again, it comes back to the problem of, and this is the problem a lot of Marxists have, is that they think the problem is the state, right? But actually the problem is us, right? We should not underestimate that we are the problem. Like we do not get along with each other well. We do not share power well. We do not negotiate economic problems well. We are our own worst problem. The workers are themselves the problem. So it has to come back to that level of the issue. Unless we're really seriously looking at ourselves as the problem, then the best options we have are within the existing nation states. So I'll just quickly say like the main division here between these is like these are basically, you have Islamic theocracies and general governmental instability, mostly in Africa. And then on the top, you have the constitutional monarchies, parliamentary republics, and presidential republics, which are basically capitalist politics. And then you have one-party states, which are proposing communist transitions, but they never work. They don't actually become dictatorships of the proletariat. They just become concentrated in one-party states. So unless we're capable of looking at that problem, then I would say the network state would most likely become some sort of you'd likely see my anticipation would be you would see little dictatorships emerge.
So you said network state instead of network nation, and it's interesting you did that mistake because network state
nation.
is considered as the dictatorship of the tech bros.
Yeah. So that's what you'll see. Though the dictatorship of the tech bros, that's most likely. That's most likely.
Yeah, and that's a great transition also to this. So just as kind of a historical context, the this concept of network state pre-existed what we are discussing here as network nations, because there was this person in the Web3 world that created like this movement called the network state. And basically, the network state is this idea of taking this proto network nations that are emerging in this digital world and creating this kind of exclave sovereign states out of them in a very dictatorial tech bro way, in a literal sense. They want that this new state has a CEO. Everyone that moves in they have no voice, and they take pride of it, because they say they prefer exit and voice, because it's like, well, if you don't like it, you just move out.
This is horrible. What you're saying is so important. Okay, so what you're saying, exactly what you're saying, this is what the American and French revolutions were about. We were trying to get away from monarchies. But what the tech bros are trying to do, they're trying to basically reintroduce monarchy as the privileged form of government.
Yeah.
We tried to move away from that, and that's what the American and French revolutions were about. So I'm saying, so I guess that's where I'm sensing into network state to network nation is trying to deal with that.
Yeah, so that's essentially like the same reaction you had from the network state is the reaction we had as well. And from that we started to think like of an alternative that is instead of being based in this private in the centralized structure, in this territorial claim that the network state had, because they conflate this into like, let's find or create or carve ourselves into a territory. They were like, well, instead let's so then the group of people in this room started to think about, I think in the beginning it was called coordinations, and then it now transitioned to being called network nations, which is kind of in a way a reaction, like a passionate reaction to the network state, similar to how you've reacted to it, but based on commons and without territorial claim, but with a sense of a kind of an idea that it would be possible that these network nations, as these decentralized translocal communities that do not make any territorial claims, so they don't try to supersede or compete with the state, even in any dimension. They're operating in kind of a different layer of abstraction than the state. And yeah, so that's a bit the origin story of the network nation. So it's very aligned to like trying to avoid this tech bro dictatorship CEO of a nation or something, but yet provide an alternative that is commons based and decentralized in a different way, that interfaces with the other institutions but provides a different institutional scaffolding to these communities that don't identify themselves with. Because the thing that started happening in practice, and we have practical examples even here, is that this concept of the network state appeared. A lot of online communities that had this form of kinship were like, "Oh, this looks like an interesting concept. I guess we are a network nation, a network state then." And then it's like, wait a minute, but we don't necessarily want to like have a CEO that governs everything very top down. We don't need to like raise money to buy land and all these kinds of things that the network state prescribes. And then the network nation is seen as an alternative. But all of that to ask a question, which is, in that capacity, there is this concept by Pasquale of functional sovereignty, which is this idea that the big corporations and the techno-feudal lords, they have a sovereignty that is functional, that exists in practice, that is like interfaces with state power kind of in an equal footing because of they granted it. And we in the network nations concept try to see, is there a positive way to think of a functional sovereignty where instead of claiming actual sovereignty and competing with the territory, we do carve a similar space than like a Uber or Facebook or OpenAI or whatever the big techs are. But instead of being oriented towards like this power coming from the power they have through the means of platforms, this power comes from the fact that we are self-organized into these networks in a voluntary manner and in a decentralized commons-based structure. So do you see the possibility of like a reclaiming of a functional sovereignty in a positive or footing in a way that is like kind of fights this functional sovereignty from these platforms based on a commons?
So what I'm getting from what you're outlining is, in philosophical terms, I would say that the tendency which the network nations exhibits in relationship to the network state, yeah. So what the network nation exhibits in relationship to the network state sounds to me like a Deleuzian rhizomatic structure. Like it's a Deleuzian rhizomatic multiplicity, right? And that is obviously has aspects of freedom and emancipation in it, but there's also the tendency to avoid dealing with the issues of concentrations of power, right? Which is what constitutional democracies and parliamentary republics were designed to deal with. It could also be that in not taking territorial claims, you could become too disembodied and you could lose the capacity for deep rooting, right? So like people need to root, people need to physically live somewhere. People don't just exist in disembodied heads on screens. So the question of land, I still think, is an important one. The major tension here that I'm seeing come up is, especially with the emphasis on self-organizing networks, is that the central tension in leftist emancipatory politics in the last 200 years is between anarchism and Marxism. Anarchists are more on the self-organizing side. They're more on the multiplicity bottom-up approach. And the Marxists emphasize that that approach will always have limitations, which appear on the level of how do we use the state for the people instead of capital? So that's the one tension I want to. So I want to first privilege the tension of the regressive one. Certainly the network state is the regressive one. The network nation sounds like the polymorphous multiplicity, the rhizomatic multiplicity. The problem you'll have is, what do you do with rooting, like roots? How do you root? You also have the problem of how do you actually deal with concentrations of power in a way that's not a regressive model, right? And again, that would be the problem of, Marxists would come up with ideas of workers' democracies, for example, but those are extremely difficult to structure. Then the second thing the second tension would be the anarchy versus the Marxism tension. The anarchy goes to the more local self-organizing. The Marxists emphasize that you need to use the state against capital. And then the third tension I want to privilege is the idea of the coordinator class. You say that the network nation comes out of the idea of the coordination. The problem that Marxists and anarchists have always dealt with is the problem of the coordinator class. Like it's very difficult to coordinate human beings. And the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat is that everyone is involved in coordination. The realistic scenario is that not that many people are actually capable of deep coordination. And then there's the idea that maybe we're talking about the 20% versus the 80%. Like that 20% of people are good at coordinating and 80% are going to have to be, as it were, following the coordinator class. So you'll have people who are very good at coordinating. And so then that folds into the previous problems I was saying. Because if you only have 20% of people who are good at coordinating, those people will have an outsized amount of power and influence. And then you have to come up with mechanisms for how to deal with these concentrations of power that are not a regressive CEO or monarchical model. So I would think about this philosophically in between, let's say, Plato and Deleuze. I would think about this politically in between Marxism and anarchism. And I would think about this as the problem of the coordinator class as the 80% or the 20%.
Yeah, very insightful. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
Can I add an additional buzzword into the mix?
Yeah.
So we are a big fan of the rhizomatic structure of
Right.
to begin with. I think another word that perhaps is interesting to add in the mix is the polycentricity word, which at least in the way in which we're trying to conceptualize network nation, it's so it's intrinsically translocal, where we use the word translocal to define like an interconnected network of local communities that are interconnecting on a global level. So it still recognizes the existence of the local specificity on the territory, but the network is a global network. And the polycentricity is more in the sense of like, so we have this we also have a lot of like weird word, but like we have conceptualized this concept of supersidiarity as opposed to subsidiarity, where subsidiarity you have concentrated power that is delegated into like smaller units. With supersidiarity is kind of the reverse, which is you have small units that choose to delegate power up to a network or to an aggregate collective because there are things that they recognize that they cannot deal on their own. And so the idea with this is that in a polycentric system, at least in theory, and that doesn't mean that the practice is the same, it is because there is not this absolute sovereignty that you have when you have territorial sovereignty, but because you have multiple centers of quasi-autonomous systems that are constantly negotiating influence with one another, then the regressive model is actually difficult to implement. It's actually very difficult to implement like a tyranny in a polycentric system because you don't have the sovereign that can be the tyrannic sovereign. It's a constant negotiation amongst all those nodes. So what we are, and this is also inspired from like all the, the decentralized networks and things like this. So what we are interested in exploring is, given the inherent polycentric nature and rhizomatic networks that those network nations emerge from, then while I completely agree with you that the easy solution is always tyranny, that's like the easiest, or benevolent dictatorship, that's a great easy one, but this cannot be implemented. It's hard to implement in such a networks, and so in some way this saves us from falling for the easy solution. Doesn't mean that we actually don't have the hard solution, but it forces us to think about the hard solution because we are not in a capacity, or no single node is in the capacity of imposing itself as the dictator.
I just want to bring up the paradox that I see today of the rhizomatic network, is that you can think that the rhizomatic network is something that escapes the quote unquote easy solution of the tyranny or the benevolent dictator. But the problem today is that because the forces of power recognize that tyranny or benevolent dictatorship can't be directly expressed like a explicit monarchy, it's being done indirectly now, right? Like Jeff Bezos and whatever, Mark Zuckerberg and whoever owns all the tech platforms, the Amazons, the Googles, the Facebooks, they can be dictator without being dictator. Like they're dictator in a indirect way, like they're already dictator when you're building the rhizomatic network. Like the rhizomatic network depends on this implicit dictatorship. Like the dictatorship is...
So yes, only if, and I think that's why we're talking about self-sovereign infrastructure. Completely agree with you if and only if the infrastructure that a network nation chooses to rely upon is the one of the techno-feudalist. However, if the network nation chooses to rely on self-sovereign infrastructure, which is essentially like peer-to-peer network, blockchain, whatever you want, the techno-feudalist, again, doesn't have power over that. And in fact, there is no centralized entity that can have power over that. And so the rhizomatic problem is solved by the rhizomatic design of the infrastructure as well.
Are there concrete examples of that existing, or is it at the moment based on like a more of a wish fulfillment?
Yeah, so the self-sovereign infrastructure exists and is being used for organizing and coordinating small-scale community, whether it can be used for organizing a network nation-level community, that's still wishful thinking.
Okay, so what I want to present as the main problem is the problem of scale. Okay, so now this is what I think we have to think. This is, for me, I'll just fully reveal my bias. I think that there's no way out of the dialectic of decentralization and centralization. Meaning that if you have a non-dialectical concept of centralization, that will fail. If you have a non-dialectical concept of decentralization, that will also fail. There has to be a dialectic of centralization and decentralization. Otherwise, you can fall into a romantic vision of rhizomatic patterns. Because what you'll usually find in rhizomatic patterns is not heaven, but its opposite. And again, the problem of us, like taking seriously the problem of the human. Like there is one moment of the human, which is trying to rebel against the father, that you'll have the scapegoating of leaders unless we deal with our father wounds. Timothy, I think you messaged me that. This, if you are rebelling against centralization as such, that is a father wound. You're rebelling against any concentration of power whatsoever. For my personal ideology, centralization and decentralization have to be thought in a dialectic, or else you'll fall into a romanticization or a utopianization of one or the other. I think the problem of scale is also something that should not be underestimated. That if you only have concrete examples of peer-to-peer or Web3 platforms on a small scale, but then don't know if it will translate into a large scale, you should assume that it won't. You should assume that when you scale up, you'll inevitably encounter the problem of power distributions. And I think that there's some great literature on this in the anarchist literature of, what is it? The Tyranny of Structurelessness by, I forget her name, but it was a famous anarchist organizer that recognized that fundamentally anarchist self-organization strategies fail when it comes to scale. Now, here I think we can go two ways. You can either confront the problem of scale head on, which to me does lead you to Marxism, or second, you can focus on the power of spread over scale, which means you stay more focused on the local spread of what you would like to see in the world. But that doesn't necessarily, but that kind of limits you in the sense that it's going to be something that's particular and singular as opposed to universal. I think anything that approaches the problem of scale and anything that approaches the universal is going to have to get your hands dirty with the actually existing states in the world and the actually existing corporations in the world. If we ignore the actually existing states in the world, I think we're just caught in a self-delusion.
The thing that you said in this second part, which is like this quote unquote ignore the problem of scale, focus on local, I think one framework to look into what we are aiming to do is kind of doing that, but then networking these initiatives, right?
Yeah.
So it's not so much networking individuals and then having these individuals to then have to deal with all the issues that you brought in, like these three pillars of tensions. But what the framing could be that each local community will have their local nodes, and their nodes will have their own forms of membership, governance, structure, dynamic. But how about we network the nodes themselves, right? So like you, as you said, like you have this pulverized local initiatives doing their thing, but there is a sense of kinship. Like, I don't know, if you have a makerspace in the rural area in Greece and a makerspace in the rural area of Brazil, it's like, well, it's not exactly the same. There's a different scale, capacity, structure, funding, etc. But there's some kinship. And what if we create the maker nation or whatever, where it's a networked structure of different do-it-yourself organizations all across the globe, that kind of stuff. And then the second process that I think that you mentioned is that I think that the idea is not to operate ignoring the existing sovereigns, the de facto sovereigns, which are the state and the corporations, but rather to actually through this organization through this network organization utilizing self-sovereign infrastructure and scaling not and scaling through this kind of translocal means, kind of find ourselves with a seat on the table, due to the fact that there is enough grounding structure and scale that we carve for ourselves through this means.
Fractally scaling as opposed to
fractal scaling. Okay, so what I just want to emphasize, two things I want to emphasize. The first thing to pay attention to is when we think, if you look at extreme political parties that don't have power, usually they forward their ideal agenda. And then the closer they get, and I'm saying this in the context of what you were saying about when we find ourselves with seats at the table, okay? We can see this, we can already study this in political parties, that political parties that don't have seats at the table, they can forward an ideal agenda, and then the closer they get to having a seat at the table, the closer they get to conforming to whatever the already given power structures are. So this happens over and over again. So at the point being, when you don't have seats at the table, you can forward an ideal agenda. When you get closer to having seats at the table, your ideal agenda will fold to the real. The second thing I want to emphasize is in regards to kinship, like people have been saying kinship in the network nation. This is my question to you guys. Is your notion of kinship biocultural or is it just cultural? When you think about kinship is originally derived from biology and family networks. Is your kinship idea biocultural, meaning not just maker spaces, but family spaces where you're reproducing yourselves? Or is it just a cultural reproduction? Right? Because if you're going to have to because any society, any serious project on this level of a network nation is going to have to be a supportive environment for the cultivation of families. If it's not a supportive environment for the cultivation of families, then it's not the future. It not only has to be a supportive environment for the cultivation of families, but it has to be a supportive environment for the cultivation of families where the children in those families want to stay in that structure and continue to reproduce it long term. So that would be what I would say the problem of biocultural kinship. So thinking about the problem on that scale, again, you'll have the dialectic of decentralization and centralization at the very least at the scale of parents and children. And then beyond that, you'll, and then I'll just finally say, in many ways, what I'm trying to do with Philosophy Portal sounds a lot like the translocal noding of networks, where I've built something as a philosophy platform, and then every week we interface with different communities, which I see as different nodes in the network. But the big challenge here is how do we go from online to the physical grounding? And how do we approach the problem of capital and the socialization of capital? Where people can do the
portal could be a network nation.
Philosophy Portal, but I don't want to call Philosophy Portal a network nation because it's just me doing my philosophy thing at the end of the day. The only person that Philosophy Portal supports is me and my family, and I can't even support my family with it. Right? Who does Philosophy Portal financially support? It supports me and my partner. That's it. And it's very precarious.
But because it's not a corporation, it's not a business.
It's a small business. It's a small business that supports me and my partner, and that's it. And she has to do a job, which is a horrible corporate AI job. I know it's not. But I'm saying these small businesses have to support families. We have to deal with actual human problems of families, that is mothers, fathers, children, aunts, uncles, grandparents, actual human networks. That's what kinship is. Kinship cannot be this disembodied notion of people who like each other in a digital space. If that's your notion of kinship, that's not a good notion of kinship. That's not going to work. It has to be a notion of kinship that's embodied. It has to be a notion of kinship that has feet on the ground and actual capacity to reproduce and deal with sexuality.
So I think you're putting the finger on something interesting. One is like the word kinship, because indeed kinship has this concept of like blood or familiarity.
Yes.
Kinship might not be the right word, or might be the right word, depending. The way we use this word is a little bit more on a abstract layer of like
kind of parallel.
The sense of belonging to a common cultural identity, and the sense of solidarity that emerged out of that, but I think you make an interesting point, which is that enough? Or is the reason that nation, in the traditional sense of nationhood, actually have this sense of solidarity is because they reproduce with one another more likely? I don't know.
Blood.
Well, I mean,
blood and genetics.
Yeah,
like
so
sex and violence.
We're trying to question whether, for sure, when you have blood, it's much stronger. Whether this linear definition of kinship that does not imply blood-based reproduction can hold, nonetheless, the concept of a nation. And we don't really have the answer, but I think that's the question that we're trying to raise.
At every marriage ceremony, the sort of formal tie is solidified by the idea of until death do us part. Right? Some bond on that level until death do us part. Timothy was telling me on text that Michelle was talking about that nations used to be something that we would die for, but in reality, it's something that you could trick teenage boys into dying for. Like that's the reality of it. Like teenage boys, not men, teenage boys were tricked into dying for the nation state. It's not like we should not romanticize it, but the question of what are we willing to die for is something that has to be asked if you're thinking about kinship. Otherwise, it's too weak. Like who are my people? Who am I going to die for? Like, and I think that has to start with, for me, like it starts with first my marriage, and then secondarily I can build slowly out from that with people who have proven themselves to be good long-term collaborators who will ride with me till the end. And that's difficult to find. It's easy to find. Here's the thing. It's easy to find people that you have a superficial similarity with online. That's easy. That's easy. And everyone can do that now. But the question of if that superficial similarity can go through the blood and the dirt and the death, that's another thing.
So just to give you a bit more context about what we're thinking about. So I think what you're saying is very true at the level of the individuals. It's like you obviously you trust your siblings more so than you trust strangers. When we're thinking about network nation, because of the fractal scaling, we're talking about kinship not between individuals but between communities. And of course, the argument is recursive. A community of people that share the same blood are more likely to be akin to one another. And in order to compensate, so you were talking before with like friendship and marriage, in order to compensate for the lack of bloody relationship, we have
sweat and tears. We replace the blood with the sweat and tears.
Exactly. So we have this concept of like entanglement, which is those communities can choose to entangle with one another. And this entanglement is actually a structural binding of those communities in such a way that it kind of becomes really, really difficult to untangle. In the same way as like if I meet someone, I become part of the same family, sure, because I'm going to reproduce into kids, but also because there is a legal binding, there is like mutualization of ownership of property and so forth. And so in order to bypass the problem of entanglement through blood, we are elaborating model in which communities can entangle themselves through alternative means, which can be structural, which can be legal, which can be economic, whatever. So that the more you commit, the more you choose to be vested into the system, then the more you're entangled, and therefore the more I can trust you to be there until the end, because it's actually very hard to get out of that entanglement.
Not only kinship amongst the peoples, but kinship with like the nature, ecology, microbiota, like yeah.
I guess I'm traditional anthropologist here because I think that the real problem is the kinship with other humans. And I think it's the kinship on, like, the problem I always thought was like when it comes to, like, for example, when I became disillusioned with communism, it was like that communists thought that they could solve global structural issues of capital, but they struggled with kinship issues with their brother, mother, father. I think those messy issues of brother, mother, father, all those things, like those can't be bypassed with abstract community. I think it's all about getting the first things first to get the second things. If you put the second things first, you're going to lose the first things. So if you put community before family, you're not going to get community. You're not going to get real community. You'll get something worse. So what I mean by that is, like, if you're working towards binding communities and entangling communities that are not built out of individuals that can have families, you're going to have worse communities. Like, you're better off staying with the current system. The question is, can we do families better than the current system? And can those families do communities better than the current system? But it has to be families first, then communities second. If you put communities before family, it's putting second things as first things, but it's not first things.
Is that a possibility that these terms get blurred in the sense that the alternative forms of family that could be explored with, like alternative forms of like raising kids that don't involve like the biological parent, but like a community of friends that, like, for example, yeah, like there are some intentional communities where people raise other people's children and like engage in there. So like basically alternative forms of family as a community, and then it blurs the line of what is like basically are communities that are friendly to raising kids or to have families in, but not necessarily are a family. I don't know. I feel like if these lines become murky, I wonder.
Should be able to include both the traditional family and the new families.
But what's being called new families aren't new families. It's just what hunter-gatherers always did. Like, what you guys are calling new families, what you guys are calling alternative families, is just what hunter-gatherers were, like, forever. Like, it's not new. It's actually, that's the more traditional family. And the reason why we moved away from it is because there's huge problems with those structures. So the problem is like what's being proposed as alternative families could be worse than what current families are. The problem we have now is that we've fallen into abstract individualism, and we've lost the skills to relate to other humans on the messiest levels. So the question is, like, it's the same thing with polyamorous communities. Like, polyamorous communities are made up of people who don't know how to do monogamy well. And you think, maybe I'll solve the problem by having sex with many people. Yeah, that's going to work really well.
You're talking in a burn community, Cadell, just to present this.
That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. I know I'm talking to a burner community, but this is the message that I think burner communities need. It's not about going back to traditional ways in the 1950s housewife and things like that. It's about, are you able to actually, in ethical integrity, deal with the complexity and messiness of human sexual relationships or not? And in honesty and in trust, like real trust that's lifelong. There's a 3-body problem in science, right? And I think it applies to socio-sexual dynamics. If you have one body, you can make predictions. If you have 2 bodies, you can make predictions, but it's more difficult. And if you have 3 bodies, the system becomes so complex that you can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow. And I think that's basically the same thing as if you're single, you can make predictions about the future of your life. If you're in a monogamous couple, you can make predictions, but it's more difficult. And if you have 3 people in the relationship, things become so complex that everyone loses the plot in a day.
Some people strongly agree, some people strongly disagree.
I like it. That's what I want. I want strong polarization. I want everyone to be angry at each other and to fight after I leave. You have to deal with the mess. You have to deal with the mess. I'm forcing you to deal with the mess.
It's like, just to close without trying to agree on that, I think that I think maybe a point of disagreement that we have independently of polyamory is I feel like if I hear what you're saying, I think that you believe that the only way to build and preserve and maintain culture is through sexual reproduction, whereas
No.
Okay, so
it has to be a biocultural model. It has to be both. You can't just privilege you can't just privilege culture at the expense of biology or the other way, because traditional religious structures do the other way. Traditional religious structures, they just privilege the biology and they don't care about the culture, but that's not the answer either. If I was speaking to a bunch of fundamentalist Christians, I would be telling them, fuck around, be polyamorous.
Yeah, so I think we believe that it is possible, especially with like network technology, that there is at least that weak sense of kinship that survive, or to actually like foster it independently of the need of reproduction, and that culture can be reproduced
But how
on a
isn't this just in service of, like, how isn't this the enemy today? Like, there's a real way in which the ideology of the rhizomatic structure cannot see that it is the ideology today. Like, the ideology today of techno-feudalism is maintained by the rhizomatic structure, where if you think that you can build kinship independent of reproduction, that's part of the post-human problem. Like, we are heading to a post-human world where humans don't, like, the question basically is, do we want to be humans still?
We're cyborgs.
Like, that's the enemy today. Like, the post-human AI capital is the problem today. The problem of the future of any network I want to be a part of is going to be grounded in a human reality. And it's going to have to deal with the messiness of being human. And for people who just want to go off into the capitalist AI rhizome, like, good luck. Like, good luck. I don't want to be there.
What about the post-capitalist decentralized Web3 rhizome?
What about the post-capitalist decentralized free rhizome?
That's just a fantasy. This whole institute you guys are at is funded by some hyper millionaire. Like, you have this nice fancy place to be at because of millionaires funding it, or a billionaire. I don't even know how much money he has. Right? It's just capital. It's just capital. It's just a nice little enclosure made by capital. That's all it is.
Okay.
It's not really dealing with human problems.
So Michelle was talking about the difference between the horizontal and the vertical. And I think maybe there's a way to think of what's being talked about here as the nation states as the cosmological vertical that has to interface with the more bioregional, family-oriented horizontal. So I'm just wondering if it's like two dimensions, and the question is then like more, how do they meet, whether it's like one or the other? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can think about the horizontal and the vertical at every level. So, like, there's a horizontal and a vertical for the family. There's a horizontal and a vertical for the community. And there's a horizontal and a vertical for the state. And the question is, how does the horizontal and vertical of the family, community, and state interrelate actually? Like, how do they actually work? Like, how do we build good communities? Sorry, how do we build good families, communities, and states? How does that work? I think it involves horizontal and vertical at all levels.
Exactly. Yeah.
But like, I want to emphasize first things first, second things second. Like, there is an order here. Like, if we want to be serious, to me, if we want to be serious and not go into the AI, like, as soon as we start talking to LLMs like they're human beings, that's where you have a problem. Like, that's what people are doing. People are talking to LLMs like they're humans, instead of actually learning, how do I talk to a human being? How do I become good at talking to human beings? First things first is families first, communities second, state is third. The problem with a lot of liberal intellectuals is that they start critiquing the state, but they don't have a good family foundation. The problem for right-wing fundamentalists, by the way, there are things you can learn from right-wing fundamentalists. Right-wing fundamentalists, they start with family. And they pretend states don't exist. They're like, can the state just go away, please? They just want to isolate themselves into a family. And they want to isolate themselves into a community that's just the same as them. But that's also a dead path. The problem is, how do we get, like what I said, how do we get the horizontal and vertical at all three levels in the right order? If we do that, then we win. But it has to come from people willing to be humans.
You have a question here from Michael.
Yeah, I think maybe like part of it is like if you follow like why has everyone chosen to be here in this room talking about network nations? Like what's the longing that's being followed here? It's probably to some degree, some of the time at least partially true, that people are responding to alienation that comes from being born into a family that actually didn't provide a nurturing environment.
Yes.
Into a community that didn't actually have connection at its core, and born into a society that also felt alienating and not life-serving. And so there is something, it's like the story, it's come up a few times, the story of the ugly duckling, trying to find its way in the world and then trying to find some other swans and in the process becoming a swan. It's like this kind of quality of, so I think what you're speaking to is real.
Yeah.
Also, the response, the gesturing towards network nations, the longing that it's coming from is grounded in the pain of not having been, the systems not being able to meet the thing. And so it's like, and is it all just about, okay, let's just learn tools and go back and do repair work in our families? Many of us come from families where actually it's beyond the pale. It's like, it's not, bureaucracy, the kind of,
Okay. So I love your provocation. This is exactly like this exact yes, what you're saying. So let's start with fundamental presuppositions. Like one of the problems I have with Marxists is that they think they can overcome alienation. Right? I recommend, if anyone hasn't read it yet, it's a book by philosopher Todd McGowan called Embrace Alienation. The idea is we're not just alienated because of capital. We're not just alienated because of the state. We're not just alienated because of a bad childhood. We're not just alienated because of we had a bad father or mother. That we're constitutively alienated. Subjectivity is the core, like alienation is the core of subjectivity. Then you have the challenge of how do I learn to befriend? How do I learn to love alienation? How do I learn to love my alienation? That's the first thing. How do I learn to work with pain? And the thing is if this longing, you said there's a longing for network nations that is coming out of a painful family upbringing or painful community experience. You can't run away from it. You have to go towards the pain. Now, that might not be rebuilding a damaged family. It might be starting your own family and reconciling through building a new family. Because maybe the family you came from is not salvageable. Maybe it's not reconciliable. Maybe it has to come from building a new family and righting the wrongs that came from the previous generation. But it can't come from you can't run from the pain of family away from family as such. You can't run away from
there's something in that one argument for monogamy is I've heard monogamy spoken about as like mountaineering, where there's some peaks that you can only climb when you've got such a high level of trust that you're like, you've got one rope tying you to someone else, you've got pickaxes. If one of you falls, no one's coming to rescue you. You're only relying on the other person. And so there's like something that can be heights that can be only achieved when there's such a deep level of trust. And that's kind of up as why monogamy can be so powerful as opposed to like more diffuse relationships. And I suppose maybe with network nations, it's gesturing towards something akin to that. Like, how can you within a community, a distributed field, like in what way can you deepen bonds of trust and coordination that go beyond just like friendship groups or even extended communities that get together for a 4-day gathering or even a burn once or twice a year and then go about their lives again? And how can those communities actually, I don't know, some kind of what you're speaking is in some way.
I'm all about that.
Yeah.
I'm all about that. That's exactly what it is. Like, but like it's again, first things and second things. So like, for example, I collaborate with a group, a religious group led by Peter Rollins, that they come together once a year. But my challenge to them is once a year, that's like, it's like the equivalent of like coming together for a burn once a year or coming together for a retreat, like on the weekend and then dispersing. It's not enough. The thing we can't avoid is day-to-day life. Why do we avoid day-to-day life? Because it's negative. Because it sucks. It's boring. It's mundane. It's the dishes. It's laundry. It's groceries. It's bills. That's day-to-day life. It sucks. And we try to escape it. We try to run away from it. Why? Because, fuck, I've got dishes in the kitchen. It's going to take me 30 minutes to fucking wash them. Then I've got to do the laundry. Then I've got to pay. It sucks. It's just boring. So, but the crucial thing is, if we avoid that, then we're constantly delaying the problem. We're escaping into a fantasy. We have to, how do we build like exactly what you were saying about the mountaineering thing, like building high levels of trust with people that scales from a partnership, like realistically, like if you can give love over your whole lifetime to more than one person of the opposite sex, I mean, then you're an exceptional individual. Like your intimacy, like your intimacy intelligence is way higher than mine, because I don't think I could do it for more than one person. That's a lot. Like another person is a lot. But then you do that, you have one person, and you ride or die with that one person. And you can build a high level of trust with one person. Then what that's a training ground. Because if you can do that on that level with one person, that increases the possibility that you're going to be able to that increases the probability that you're going to be a good friend. Like, because you can take those skills that you've built in a long-term relationship, they're transferable to friendship. Friendship is also sexual, intellectually. It's idea sex. So if you really have a good friend, it's idea sex. And it's good sex. Like, but again, it's first, like, you want to build the primordial skills at the most intimate location. It has to be the most intimate location, and then scale from there. And you can become the type of person that can actually build interfaces between communities that's enriching. But it has to be step by step by step, and it can't be avoiding day-to-day life.
It's interesting, Cadell. I feel you're presenting like really the tantric versus the sutric.
It has to be both.
Yeah.
It has to be both.
How do you do the proper synthesis? Because right now you're really presenting the sutric. It's interesting also because many people also know.
But if I was yeah. But the problem, if you have the tantric without the sutric, guess what you're going to have? You're going to have a community of, like, if you have the tantric without the sutric, what you're going to get is a community of perverts. That's what you're likely going to get. But if you have the sut, but what do you get? But what do you get if you have the sutric without the tantric? Well, then you just get repressive society, right? So you have what you want to. The line we're walking is between repressive society and perverted society. We want to avoid both, but in order to avoid both, it takes a lot of skill.
But what you're talking to in that subject object, if you were to ask like a Sufi, they would say, well, that is the beloved, right? So the original sin, or if you were to ask a Christian, original sin is the split from the object into the subject, right? So there is this longing back into the objectivity, which is, if you were to look at any wisdom tradition, is basically what they're saying at the core of it. So that is then at the core of what you're saying is like, the underlying longing is the longing back into objectivity, which can never happen on a subjective level aside from sort of non-dual like experiences. So then
yeah. I want to avoid the non-dual, but it has to do with this subject-object relationship and the split at the core of our being. And I take your point or your question to be how, like, it's basically the question is, how do we enter objectivity well?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Like, how do we enter objectivity? I guess I'm saying it has to start with the intimate ground, and it has to start with the intimate split, which we come into this being through sexuality. So any starting point into objectivity to me would have to go through that route. And I think that's why, like the Christian story of original sin, it's completely covered in sexual metaphor. Like Eve biting the apple, the snake tempting her and talking to her and putting weird voices in her head. And then Adam being naked, covering up because he bit the apple. He's ashamed. It's all sexual. It's all intimate. It's all just a big sexual metaphor. But it is a story that's offering us some clues for how do we get into objectivity and how did we lose contact with objectivity. of course, in a way, we never lost contact with objectivity because when we were quote unquote in objectivity, we didn't exist.
But then
our very existence is introducing the problem of how do we enter objectivity.
My question back to you then would be, is what you're describing as the finding of that in the intimate relationship with one other person, is that even enough? Is there something
it naturally goes beyond itself into the community. The intimate other, you don't want to.
He actually means.
I actually mean even deeper than that, right? So that original longing towards, whether you look at it from a biophysical perspective of like, you know, getting back into the egg, into the single, then that actually even precedes the communing with another person in marriage or in a partnership.
But we don't want to go back. The fantasy is going back into the womb or the egg. Like
I know.
I want to avoid that.
Understanding what the drive is. What is the driver?
The drive is the split from that.
Yeah, exactly.
The drive is the split.
You can never heal it.
No, you never heal it.
You can never.
No, that's what I mean. We have to embrace alienation. The split is fundamental.
Right. But again, this is where any esoteric tradition will say, well, you get that through a communion with something that's like, whether you call the Tao, the God, you know, whatever.
Like tradition, like if we're talking about traditional society, like if you like look at the data from like traditional India or even traditional like medieval Europe, usually you would have about an 80-20 split between people who do family life and practical life and people who go off into monastic contemplation. Right? So usually you have a split between I'm going to do my family life, practical business, or I'm going to do monastic contemplation and I'm going to leave society. I think the question we have today increasingly among spiritual communities is how do I have the monastic contemplation and the deep spiritual life and family life and business and
you have multiple traditions that do that, right? Like, so you have
like, I'm not saying only one can do it.
Or whatever, that is the main goal of like how are your householder and a monastic at the same time. That is embedded in sexual relevance, biocultural sphere.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think
absolutely. That's the level of the challenge. That's the level.
Okay, thank you so much, Cadell. Okay. We're gonna close here. I think that what Primavera was proposing is that if you want to meet and discover a semi-functional monastic business and community vibe, you should come to Château du Fait in France. I already told you that. And
I live in France.
And
we figure out how to make this Sutrik really fun and enjoyable.
Absolutely. No, prohibition is fun. We have to enjoy the lack. I have to enjoy the fact that I failed right now. Okay.
And what I'm showing here, Cadell, in the back, is actually the website of the Genesis Experience that's happening at the end of September in Brussels.
Yes, come to Brussels.
Well, we'll talk about family, community, and society with Michel Bauwens, with Cadell, and with Pamela and some others. Thanks so much for your time.
Peace out, guys. Bye-bye.